Clémence Boulouque, who is going to be introduced properly in a moment by Christia Mercer. And she's here to talk about her book, Nos Apocalypses. And so Clémence will be introduced and in conversation with Christia Mercer, who is Gustave and Bern Professor of Philosophy here at Stanford University. So I'm Shannon here, and I'm just here to welcome all of you and say thank you for coming and how pleased we are to be offering this event to you tonight. It is co-sponsored by the Maison Française as well as the Department of the Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies, IRCPL, and the Department of Religion. So welcome, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to Benamozegh and Christia.
I'm very. My French pronunciation is not exactly great, and so I'm not going to embarrass myself. I'm not going to shame myself in front of my friends here and try to pronounce French, but I can read it, so that there is some advantage to that. Now, I have to say that this book is just a wonderfully. Oh yeah, I have to do this. Oh yeah. Is this working? Is this working?
Yeah, you'll do the same for me.
And forgive me, I have been talking to undergraduates for 4 hours, so if my throat suddenly goes out or I start growling at people, that's the reason. Anyway, I'm so happy to have a chance to introduce this person in this book. It's just a wonderfully rich book by an erudite scholar with an extraordinary range. One of the joys, I have to say, of being a senior professor at Columbia is to have the opportunity to meet brilliant, young, energetic scholars. And Clémence Boulouque is exactly one of those such people. Now, yes, Professor Boulouque is a great, has many academic accolades. She's the Carl and Bernice Witten Associate Professor in Jewish and Israel Studies at Columbia University, co-editor of the Stanford Studies and Jewish Mysticism series, and she's active in many, many other academic pursuits. Her interests range from Jewish thought, mysticism, and Kabbalah, something I'm very interested in, by the way, through the intersection of religion and the arts, all the way to the study of the unconscious. But the professor is much more than that. She's also a creative and wide-ranging academic, clearly, but she's also much more than merely a wide-ranging academic. She's also part of the living, breathing world outside of academia. She is a prize-winning novelist and art critic, and she is an activist, passionately devoted to making the world better. I know firsthand how much she cares about her students and about teaching, how much she cares about sharing the power of ideas, and how devoted she is to justice. One reason I know so much about my wonderful colleague in this way is that I created and oversee a program called Just Ideas, a program I run in a maximum security prison in Brooklyn, New York. It's a federal maximum security prison, and it's a hellhole, if I say to be brief about it. That program is devoted to sharing great ideas with incarcerated men and women. Until I met and got to know Clémence, I had never intended on ever having a junior faculty member teach in that program, partly because it's so time-consuming, but also because it requires a kind of strange pedagogical power to go into a class and speak with authority, but also hear what these amazing men and women, mostly men, have to say. But when Clémence asked me if she could teach, I broke my rule. I somehow knew that she would be terrific, and she absolutely has been. So I want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank her for that. So it's with utmost pleasure that I have the opportunity to chair this session with Professor Boulouque and to talk about our apocalypses. Like her, the book is fluent across languages, times, rich in thought, and full of passion. So here's the plan that we devised. She is going to speak somewhat briefly about the book. There was, I think, an intention of maybe giving a lecture. We thought that it would be much more fun for her to speak for 10 or 15 minutes. I have a couple of nerdy, I'm a historian of philosophy, so I have a couple kind of nerdy philosophical questions to ask, which I know she can deal with quite happily, and then we'll open things up for questions. So that's the general idea. So, the professor.
Thank you so much, Christia. Thanks for this generous introduction. It's been one of the greatest joys of my life to be able to take part in Just Ideas, and hopefully we'll take it much further. Thank you to la Maison Française, Shani, to the religious department, the Department of Religion, sorry, and to everyone who made this event possible. It feels very special to be here, to be back. I guess the Maison Française is the last place where an event was organized before BC, before COVID. So that was February of 2020, and then the rest is really history. I'm also very moved to be here tonight because it all started here, not here, but virtually at Columbia. When it became clear in the summer of 2020 that we would not connect to campus and that we have to teach on Zoom, it felt like I had to come up with a course that could probably help students find their way or make sense of this new world of ours, of darkness, and that maybe by turning to the responses of religious traditions to epidemics, they would be able to find some sort of semblance of meaning to the world that seemed to have lost its balance and meaning. So really turning to the responses of people who come before us and to religious traditions felt like that was a worthy pursuit. So I didn't pick up, as I mentioned to a few friends, I didn't pick up sourdough or baking. Instead, I tried to read and write, and so that became the course called From Exodus to the Coronavirus. I could have come up with a better title, but there it was, and it would be strange to say that I enjoyed the materials. And it would be strange to say that I enjoy teaching this class, because obviously I would have rather never taught any course approaching what felt so close to home, but I must say that I found them uniquely fascinating. So I kept researching at the end of the semester, and then I had a phone call with an editor and dear friend of mine, and I started speaking about what I had just finished teaching. And I remember her response was when I said, "Well, that's really interesting. That could be a book." And she said, "Well, totally, and I'll go and write it." And so, which I did. She almost hanged up on me, but she was like, "Now you go." And so I did write it. And this is Nos Apocalypses. So I'll just give you a brief survey or primer of the book. Which has many entry points. You can read it as a book that deals with literature, not just religion, the way in which literature describes religion. But I also want to reflect about a few things that struck me as I was writing this book and trying to make sense of it all and how. And when I guess that whoever has not been changed by the pandemic is a sociopath. So the way in which we were changed by this event and the magnitude of the despair and of the losses is what guided me. And so first and foremost, religion and epidemics have a lot in common. Because epidemics are mass mortality. The mass mortality of epidemics make us face and ask ourselves ultimate questions about life, death, our fragility, and everything in between. and what we are ourselves in the face of this this endless crisis, and what we owe to others. So there's also something else, which is the virus was also this. Everybody became fluent in droplets and became armchair epidemiologists, but it's also about what we don't see, the unknowable, the unpredictable, the imperceptible, and how we react to something that exceeds our understanding, that is beyond us. So also, if you pay attention, even fleeting attention, you realize that you could hear religious language when people were saying that they did not believe in COVID, or there were also stickers, believe in science. So there was also this very deeply rooted religious beliefs that were at stake and that I was interested in exploring. So yeah, again, a place in which we're faced with our finitude, but also a place in which we have to confront our failures. And so obviously a lot has been written about how the pandemic has exposed the structural fissures or fractures really of our society, how it widened social inequality, how it affected the most vulnerable. And in the beginning, when essential workers were obviously the first, there were frontline workers. Then afterwards, we know that the percentages shifted and that people in the South, rural and in GOP dominated areas have now outnumbered people, minority and urban victims of COVID. So that's another aspect of society that we need maybe to think about. But that's clearly revealed the ills of our society. And this is literally the meaning of the apocalypse, right? Revelation. So that really prompted me to think about what happens in the scriptures when the plague or epidemics strike. So first of all, it's always very sudden, as we've also experienced. A few weeks before, nobody could anticipate the magnitude of this disaster, or maybe we're not willing to acknowledge that could turn out this way. But in Hebrew, it's magifas, so something that really punches you and almost takes you by surprise. And in general, a plague strikes to highlight the societal problems. So usually, the wrath of God is directed to human beings who are not worthy, who are sinful, etc. But it also highlights how there are deeper structural problems. And so it's not completely irrelevant that the horsemen of the apocalypse, the black horseman, horseman on black horse, actually is one that has scales. And so presumably that means justice or something to that effect. But actually there's a voice that says that you should preserve oil and wine, which were actually at that time very precious ingredients. And that shows that probably the wealthier in the Roman Empire were preserved. So that there is no equity, no equal treatment when the disaster strikes. And then the fourth one, the pale horseman, is obviously the plague. But the idea of the third one, so on the black horse, that announces the plague that has to do with social injustice. And we know that the Roman Empire was plagued with inflation and economic problem, is also really interesting. And so what we see also in this religious text is that it challenges the notion of divine justice. So we know, since Susan Sontag, we know that she writes that there is an assumption that a sick person actually deserves it somehow. That's what she wrote in Illness as a Metaphor. So that might still be, at the subconscious level, maybe that's still the case, that people think that, getting ill is actually about your failure in character. But what you see in the scriptures is that it's become less and less from Exodus, where there's clearly a response of God to Pharaoh's inequity and sins, and it sort of moves towards a moment in which it's all about human responses to what happens. So God is almost taken out of the equation, which is fascinating. And clearly it becomes about what we owe to one another. And that's also because actually epidemics are a place in which you can test the articulation between faith and responsibility. And so that was extremely interesting to read and compare those texts with the behavior of certain communities back in the early stages of the pandemic, when, as we know, that also meant cases that went to the Supreme Court, but there was a lot of resistance from worshippers to the closure of churches, synagogues, and I was also interested in probing why and how textually grounded this resistance to public health guidance had been motivated. And actually, as a scholar of religion, it's fascinating to see how selective choices presided in those religious observances. So, for instance, we're in New York, so that was not very far from here, but some of the very ultra-Orthodox communities that really follow the Talmud and that considered this authoritative text had a reading of those texts that differs from what the text actually says. So, for instance, I just want to share with you what one of the tractates say about the state of affairs when there is a plague. It says, "The sages thought, if there is a plague in the city, a person should not walk in the middle of the road, due to the fact that the angel of death walks in the middle of the road, as, since in heaven they have given him permission to kill within the city, he goes openly in the middle of the road. By contrast, if there is peace and quiet in the city, do not walk on the sides of the road, since, as the angel of death does not have permission to kill within the city, he hides himself and walks on the side of the road." So first of all, I think that the text is a fantastic testament to the religious imagination of the rabbis, and it's almost out of a horror movie. Like in normal times, death is secretive; it lurks in the shadow, and like you almost can hear the cracking of a door in a horror movie. Which it's not a genre that I particularly like, but that's how I imagine them. Whereas in times of plague, death is completely emboldened, and to many, New Yorkers, it will bring back the memory of those gigantic refrigerated trucks in front of hospitals, the makeshift morgues, and that really, death, the angel of death was really walking in the middle of the road during all those weeks. And what the text also suggests is that under such circumstances, one should be prudent and humble, because moral smugness is always debunked in the Talmud, but also a few lines later in the same treatise. So it says, "Once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. And not only that, but it begins with the righteous first, as it is stated in the verse, and you will cut off from the righteous and the wicked." So it's the book of Ezekiel, where the mention of the righteous precedes the wicked. So Rav Yosef cried and said, "Are all those righteous people all compared to nothing when calamity strikes?" Abai said to him, "It is goodness for the righteous that they die first, as it is written, the righteous is taken away because of the evil to come." So that's a verse from Isaiah. so that it will not have to endure the suffering that will befall the people. So the only reward, I mean, I'm sorry to break the news, but maybe it's a room of evil people, so maybe it doesn't concern you, but the only reward of the righteous is to go first. And not having to go through the agony of seeing death and possibly the passing of loved ones is the only dubious privilege that the text grants to righteous people, but also a psychologically acute observation. But in any case, it's thinking that your own righteousness or self-righteousness will protect you is delusional, and the text is another lesson in humility. So there are many other instances of discussion of the Talmud, but what I also wanted to convey when I compared those sources to other people's behavior, even if there were marginal, behaviors, is that religion is also contextual, and that in a number of instances, those scriptures say one thing, and a few lines down, it's opposite. And instead of trying to make things fit nicely and not attend to the messiness, which I think is a fabulous messiness, by the way, and the creativity of the text, it's really important to acknowledge that there is a polyphony in them, and that minority opinions or dissent are registered and are part of our culture. So trying to imagine or thinking that those traditions don't contain those tensions is actually something that is an extremist or fundamentalist point of view. So what I try to emphasize also in the book, as I do in my research, is that religion is for sure a set of practices and rituals, but it's also a place that is a very literary, rich corpus with multiple voices and dissonant dissonant voices that help us think deeper about those questions, those alternate questions, and that just the very fact of acknowledging that those questions are actually questions that we wrestle with rather than answers is what connects us. So that's why the subtitle is Ce qui nous lie lorsque le mal nous frappe, and really returning to the religious imagination of those texts to think about our times, but also to think beyond our times, I think is crucial in a world in which divisiveness seems to want to have the final word. So.
Is this, no.
It has to not be...
Okay, this is working. Okay, good. If you don't mind, I was going to ask you to read the first paragraph of the book, because, one of the things that's wonderful about this book is that there's just some sentences and some paragraphs that are so beautifully written. And I think when you talk about a pandemic, and you talk about suffering, and you talk about loss, and you talk about the confusion that comes from that, there's something right about writing about that in a beautiful way. So do you mind doing that? I would even do it, except it would be so terrible. And my friend, with my
have to borrow your book.
You have to borrow my book. But this first paragraph in particular, I just thought, I can't wait to read more. Yeah.
Religion et épidémie ont de singulières similitudes. Elles nous confrontent à l'invisible, à notre finitude et aux mystères ultimes, à ce que nous faisons de ce temps qui nous est compté, et à ce que nous devons à nous-mêmes et aux autres. Elles sont nos chambres noires.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to be a little bit of a nerdy historian of philosophy for a second, and just
I love nerds.
and raise a couple of questions for you, and maybe even for the audience. I'm a contextualist historian of philosophy, which I take to mean something like the following. I'm not really very inclined to embrace this idea of the great men marching, along in a series of beads on a string, but rather we need to take the beads off and kind of put them in the general context. And if you do that, then first of all, you discover, lo and behold, there are a lot of women and people of color and all kinds of people who contributed significantly to the history of philosophy who've been written out. That's one of the things I'm really very keen to work on these days. But also one thing that I think is really important for us to understand, and when we think about the history of philosophy, is though it may be the case that Aristotle and Aquinas and Descartes, or whoever it is, ask a lot of the same questions. They look like the same questions, but if you really kind of think about the context in which the questions are being asked, you begin to realize, much less what the answers are, what answers are given, you begin to realize that in fact those questions are radically different. They sound the same, what is justice, or what is a just society, but in fact for Aristotle he meant what is justice for white male property owners, basically. He didn't care at all about the enslaved people who actually kept Athens running, or Descartes, what is truth? The truth is supposed to be some eternal set of internal ideas that only a few people are able to have. So for me, it's just very, very interesting to note that some of the most profound questions that we often think of as kind of eternal philosophical questions are just not exactly what they seem. And so, but one thing that was so moving to me about this book, and really revelatory, is that I realized that in fact, when it comes to death and dying and despair, that some of these questions just cut across genre, they cut across literature, and think, well, yeah, it's really terrible that there was a plague in Florence, or it was really terrible that Job suffered the way he did. But until I suffered this, until we kind of understood profoundly the fact that we didn't know what our community was. We were all turned inside. We were all fearful of even being nice to somebody on the street. The extent to which some people became very selfish, some people became very, maybe a little bit too unselfish, and then as a consequence sometimes died. It's not just the refrigerator trucks, but the people, I could get teary-eyed, the nurses and the doctors and people who were literally dying because they were, in hospitals. But there was also something about the sublimity of it. So I rode my bicycle all the way down Amsterdam Avenue just after the lockdown here in New York City. And on the one hand, it was just astonishingly depressing because there was nobody, literally, I was the only person on the street. I'm in the middle of Amsterdam Avenue, by the way.
So you were not the angel of death, though. Just for the record.
So I was on my bike. But it was also sublime. There was something beautiful and awesome and wonderful about it. So one of the things that is, I guess my first question is just a question about how this problem, the problem of suffering and communal suffering and so on, prompts us to sort of see humanity across time and space in this profound way. And then I guess a slightly different question is, how perverse it is or not to think of that as a source of sublimity, that just you somehow get outside yourself and realize that this too has happened to many other people who have suffered in some way similar to me.
Right. This is that question of how we can sort of cut across time and create. Religion is obviously, there's this notion of connection. One of the possible etymologies of religion is how, creating those links. But it was also really important to hear the voices and to hear those concerns, those ultimate concerns in ancient Greece, right? We're talking about Boccacio, but the birth somehow of the Greek's religion, of civic religion, comes with the plague in Athens, and so the question of how did people react? Do you turn inward, or are you there for others? How do you treat the strangers? Because in the plague, which actually was not a plague, we had to wait for the Olympics in Greece to realize that it was typhoid fever, but because it was written as the plague of Athens, which is also a problem of a translation. Translation is one of the four supporting actors of the book. that became a staple for playwriting. And so when Pericles decided that, like to fend off an offensive, everybody had to be within the walls of Athens, he also took in people from the countryside. And there was a backlash against them. So the insider-outsider, how do you create a sense of community when disaster strikes? In scapegoating also comes with epidemics. The Black Plague, I mean the great death wave of the plague of the late 14th century, late 14th century that actually lasted for centuries, and that in the 18th century was multiple waves. I hope that it's not, there will be no repetition of such, successive waves, but is also when Jews, migrants, and comedians, also like outsiders, were extremely persecuted just because they were the other, something which on the body of citizens seemed to be extraneous. So that's, and look what happened, anti-Asian racism and the China virus, to quote the former president. But there is those mechanisms of exclusion of others based on fear or based on, maybe a human temptation to reject those who don't squarely fall within the ambit of what you imagine should be your clan or your tribe. Is something that you see over and over again. And interestingly, so that was also what prompted me to, create this course, so that we were all, I have really feel sorry for first-year students or students who were in their parents' basement because we were isolated. But because, like, by looking at other of previous generations or voices, by hearing voices of those who came before us and talking about them as a community, I think that was something that provided some sense of comfort, solace, because we were in this together. Not, as we know, like we're in this together, crumbled as a motto quite quickly, because there was no transcendence, like there was no way in which the better angels of her took over, but we were able to be in a community that extended time and place, and I feel very close to some of the text from the 15th century, and there is this kind of kinship, which is also what the humanities are about. Like there is something that a bond that we need to nurture also by turning back and by revisiting those texts and learning from them. And not just for not just to illuminate our experience, but also as almost a tribute to those who came before us and who wrestled with similar questions, and not be judgmental about their responses. I mean, when it's a pogrom, you can be judgmental. When there is, this backlash against marginal figures, there's something there that also needs to be looked at and put under a microscope in order to eradicate, because this is a real virus.
One more question, and then we can. I have another question, and we can open it up for more general conversation. First of all, you don't know this, but Tony Kushner's Angels in America is one of my favorite things ever.
He's an alum, right? He loved Litham, as I understand.
He would?
He loved his Litham experience. So,
yeah.
Sorry, Columbia Core Literature Humanities, and he was a student of the course.
Yeah. And so, and actually when the pandemic hit, I stayed up. There's I think it's Mike Nichols did a version.
The HBO series.
Yeah, and I stayed up till like 4 in the morning or something watching it. But
sleep patterns during the pandemic were not a thing.
Exactly. But one of the things about Angels in America, one of the things about, you mentioned Coppola's Apocalypse Now, there's just so much art that when you put it together in the context of pandemic, becomes, again, there's this connection across the genre. And I hadn't thought before that war is a kind of pandemic. You know, that Apocalypse Now is about that horrible suffering, what you do in terms of how the individual responds to the group and so on. But so I'm just struck by, how diverse the sources are, and I really thought that was wonderful about the book. But I guess my question is, it seems that there's moments in the book where you focus primarily on the sufferer, the way in which human beings, individuals, suffer individually and as a group. Just a little historical insertion, by the way. One of the things about the plague that kept sweeping Europe, I've been reading about this because it's some work something I'm working on. And the first wave of plague, we know from Boccaccio, often like 2/3 of the population of a town would be wiped out. But then in the next, maybe 10 or 20 years later, it would come back. And it was only the children who died, or primarily the children who died, because everyone else had antibodies. And so just imagine, like you somehow managed to repopulate your town, and then anyone who has a child under the age of whatever it is, would die. And so there's so that's a special kind of suffering. But one thing you also talk about, Clémence, is like you talk about Pericles, or you talk about Athens, you talk about Oedipus, and these are cases of leaders having to deal with suffering. So there's sort of two tracks a little bit in the book, and I wonder, what you think we can learn from both just the understanding of communal suffering and, like again with Kushner, with Angels in America, there's something so moving about people suffering from AIDS. I mean, everybody was dying, as we know, but there was suddenly the need to do anything he could to protect, to get the drugs out, and so on. So there was an understanding that the community had to respond with violence sometimes. Black Lives Matter. I think if it hadn't been for the pandemic after George Floyd's death, we would not have moved as far as we've moved in response to police violence of a certain sort. So that's communal acting, but then you also really note very well the acting and need for leaders to respond. So I just wanted to know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so first, Angels in America, I think, is just one of the most fantastic midrash about suffering by an atheist, communist Jew who keeps failing at everything that he does. So the main character of Angels in America.
And yet, can I say the person who speaks at the first of the play is a rabbi?
Right. Yeah, the rabbi, who's, by the way, in the HBO miniseries, is none other than Meryl Streep, who also is actually has 3 different parts. And just for her performance, you have to watch the miniseries. But yeah, this question of leadership is also very much, at the core of the religious and also literary responses to plagues and epidemics. I mean, the first one, the first guilty person, culprit, is really Pharaoh. So someone, and God's punishment for Pharaoh is to harden his heart. So which is interesting because his heart was already hard enough, that impenetrable enough that he would not listen to Moses and Aaron asking to let the Israelites out. But it is also because of his sins, because of his refusal to let go of his ego that the disaster befalls the Egyptian people. And so I have a kind of typology in the book of the pharaohs, our pharaohs, contemporary pharaohs. So those, I mean, by definition, you can't rule over a virus, you can't rule over a pandemic. So refusing the reality principle is also a sign of pharaohism, or that mental constitution that creates this refusal of acting for the good of the people, and that creates a sort of united front of strongmen. I mean, that when you look at COVID responses across the world, there is a type that emerges. From Bolsonaro in Brazil to the person I'm not going to name twice today, to Putin. And so there is also this notion of a humility that that science actually demands, because it's fluid. There is trial and error. And so that's why also believing in science as if it was a kind of sentence, ultimate sentence, also doesn't make a lot of sense. It is a process that those leaders are not able to process and take account. Like it is about uncertainty and dealing with uncertainty and the humility that comes with it. So that's also something which is a theme that's a huge part of the book, and how, in order to deflect the responsibility of what is seen as some sort of guilt or responsibility, then you'll direct the wrath of the populace to marginal and fragile communities, which is that was basically the case also during the Black Death. It was not necessarily, it was really a trickle-down effect, and from top down, more than just persecution by single people. So it was really, just like the protocol of the elder of science, like you do have this way of deflecting the blame and redirecting onto fragile communities. But I also wanted to say, as you mentioned, it's like this double tragedy of the loss of young children during those successive waves. That's also the case of Ben Jonson that I mentioned in the book, who wrote The Alchemist, which is another type of the comment, right? Because with this uncertainty emerges a kind of behavior that is, credulity is very much part of the story of pandemics, and religious credulity even more so. But Ben Jonson was, one of those parents who lost their young children because, again, they had no immunity, they built no immunity, and so I think that in the suburbs of London, 3/4 of in the cemetery of Gravestone are actually from children aged 0 to 7. So
I think it might be good to open this up for questions. I'm happy to blather on and have more questions, but I think it would be good to hear from other people.
I had a question. Just could you say again what the name of your course was? I missed it.
From Exodus to the coronavirus. I'm not so proud of the title, but it was actually religion and epidemics. It was a cheap rhyme, I guess. But we were also perturbed.
I wanted to ask about the process of translation. I know that you mentioned that you taught the course in fall of 2020 when we were all teaching over Zoom. So that is itself a kind of translation, and you kind of reinvent the way you speak and teach. So I would love to hear about that, and then how you translated it into a book in French. So you're dealing with sources that are from a variety of languages. So I'd love to hear about translation on the kind of literal level, and then the kind of more metaphorical, how that felt going from place to place.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Isabel. So yes, I mean we had 2 days to move to Zoom in March 2020, and so we had to self-translate ourselves. I guess, and as time went by, things didn't. I mean, maybe our faces froze less often, and we knew how to have this kind of emergency moments of like, well, let's reboot the whole thing. Let's troubleshoot Zoom like we've become experts somehow. But there was a need to embody the text, I guess, because again, like it's not being wizard and saying that when there's no physical presence, you have to embody things differently. So I tried to bring in other materials, or have movies and art in order to also get students' attention for and try to keep them engaged. So that's it was probably more interactive than a traditional lecture. So that was, but that's pretty standard. That's what we all went through. And as for the today self-translation, well, so there are passages in the book where you hear my voice of 2020, 2021, so confronting the experience of living in the epicenter for, in March and April to those texts. And so honestly, I don't think that the French in general, French people have understood how it felt like to actually lose your neighbor, to lose so many people, and to see how near and everywhere the death was. So I also had to conjure up and delve back into those moments in order to create the atmosphere of apocalypse. There's a documentary that just came out, so those empty streets. So I know that in France, in Paris, they were able to hear the sound of the Seine, which I never realized that actually you could hear the river. But that's because of lockdown. But there was this necessity to translate a mindset for a French audience. Same with Black Lives Matter. I remember one of when we had helicopters, and so that's not necessarily something that was immediately intelligent. That it had to be rewritten in order to be shared. So, and usually, it's maybe like 3 or 4 times in the book that I talk about comparing the experience of living through a pandemic to what others lived before, what others described. So that was a process of translation. And then for the sources, I've realized, so, Angels in America, for instance, is not translated into French. So I had to contextualize. I know, this is outrageous. This has to stop. This has to change. If the book serves any purpose, then you have to have a translation of Angels in America. But that doesn't exist. So I had to also explain without being too, without this being too much of a pill, but trying to explain why this text matters, why depicts the AIDS era better than anything else, and how it contributes to our understanding of, reflection on history, the angel of history. So that was the more challenging aspect, and also some of the translations from the Talmud, for instance, there are readily available translations of the Talmud in English. That's much less the case in French. So I realized that this is a secular country. Also, France is a secular country, also because of the scarcity of some of the resources of translation of texts that are traditional Jewish scriptures that are not available in English, in French. So in a way it was liberating, because sometimes when you have a translation of the Talmud that you don't really like in English and you're just fixing it, you have to explain that it's your own translation, but grounded in another translation. Whereas in French, I just cited the Talmud and that was it. And parenthesis translations are mine. So.
Thanks. I'm really looking forward to reading it in my somewhat more skillful French than it used to be before I went to Paris. But so one question I have is we saw obviously the intensely political reactions, of course, here. I don't even need to go through the two sides, that were most clearly defined. But I'm wondering if in the sources that you're looking at, whether you see a kind of, whether this is a kind of historically, culturally particular reaction because of a certain religious climate also in the United States. Or in your sources, do you see any analogous splits like that, where you get people, aside from the scapegoating and those kinds of things, which you kind of identify in many environments, whether you see a kind of particular split like that plays out politically and socially?
Right. So you do have. Basically, the split is what your faith requires versus what the public health or civic engagement would call for. You do see this, but it's the previous massive epidemics were the 1918 influenza. So in a way, democracy, for instance, during the cholera epidemic, it was more at the communal level than a clash between exerting your freedom versus obeying the whatever public health requirements. So I think that it's also a new way, a way in which those two injunctions or clash. That is also, that is very much, that was found obviously to an extreme here, but also across Europe, this question of how do individual freedoms, how can you protect individual freedoms versus state decrees, or how do you reconcile those two aspects of someone's life. When it comes to religion, the reaction of religious leaders. So how do you balance basically the principle of precaution that sometimes viruses or epidemics require versus religious imperatives, basically? There is a few examples, in Italy with rabbis who actually suspended religious congregations in order to protect lives, or instead of being a synagogue, allowed people to be behind a window. There's also a very striking example in Warsaw in the 19th century, where you're not supposed to, obviously, Yom Kippur observants are supposed to fast. And this rabbi actually, whether it's completely mythical or apocryphal or not, but ate in the synagogue in order to set an example and say, there is this there's injunction in the Bible, which is really people nefesh, that you have to save lives no matter what, and that Deuteronomy, I place before you life and death. You'll choose life in order to live. So he embodied this transgression, which is a really interesting moment. And most of the time, you see that also in Islam. There is, obviously you have this a faithful and maybe blind faith that wants people together no matter what, but there is also an equally powerful current that says that those rules have to be suspended. Like Islam, because of the Justinian plague, at the very early stages of, when around the birth of Islam, that was also very much part of the Islamic mindset. Muslim that, first of all, the plague, someone who dies of plague is actually a martyr, so you don't have to go after people and scapegoat those who brought the disease. And so there was never any example of scapegoating in Islam, and as well. There were many epidemics, but there is, this clash between observance and protection of life is probably the one thread answering your question. But again, the stakes are higher because we live in democratic states, so that's also maybe the price to pay for it, and the tensions are higher because of those two.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful presentation of the book, and I'm also looking forward to reading it. And as I was listening to your presentation, I was reminded of a book that recently came out, also sort of like a consequence of the pandemic, which is Bruno Latour, Lessons for the Confinement or the Lockdown. And I was wondering if you read the book. I guess like you were not aware of it while you were writing your own book, but if you established a dialogue with the book. And I was wondering if your motivation for writing it was also try to describe this new world to which we have to adapt to morally, scientifically, and in many other ways, which is what I got by reading Latour's book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thanks for bringing up the name and memory of Bruno Latour, which is, it's obviously a huge loss. And obviously, how to not think of this is towards the end of the book that I mentioned the question of ecological justice and in relation with Tibetan Buddhism and the Mamos, so those deities who make humanity pay when the Anthropocene acts up and really overstep the boundaries of what's acceptable. So that, resituating this conversation within those confines is also something that I was interested in doing. And unfortunately, the book, we were writing at the same time, and I wish we had been in conversation with them. But so maybe if there is an English edition, which I really hope, because that would be a case of retranslating translation, I would very much, add this aspect to the book. And yeah, I mean, I guess this is also an intervention in trying to see how what we can elicit from the text, from those scriptures, can amplify, I mean, elevate voices, again, those minority voices that were sometimes silenced, but also trying to be more creative in ways in which we're trying to address those catastrophes, and also think of our place in relation to others. So I also wanted to mention that, I mean, this is how the book ends, that in the Bible, there's a number of rituals. So you can read the rituals as something which is just burdensome and boring, and that you skip over. You know, it's just like the biblical genealogies you can skip over, and you know, no pain, no gain. But there's also a way in which you can read the text without getting into those details. But one of the ways in which the Bible think about people re-entering the world and society after a disease and epidemic has, I mean, it is disturbing for our sensibilities, but it's also very much symbolically interesting. So you have to take two birds, sacrifice one, slaughter it, and smear with the blood of that sacrificed bird the other one. And this other one you let out, and you free, and you set free and let fly. And so obviously animal sacrifices are I mean, loathsome, but there is this idea of what is it that is dead in someone having overcome or survived this experience, this traumatic experience, and what is it that you keep, right? That presence of death that is actually a new lease on life, and that sets you free, is one of those examples that I think should be part of our collective, or should be, I mean, it's politically interesting, but it's also something that can guide us as we re-enter those new lives, knowing that something has died, but that there is a sort of freedom or freeing of oneself for those new chapters. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's also a credo of mine, that reading those religious texts as literature, and hearing all those voices, and not just as something that is owned by one tradition or the other, can only enrich the way in which we live together.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, but I'm going to ask one. Your question, and actually all of these questions have been like really, really important. And one question I wanted to mention is related to ritual and just memory and the need to remember. And so just as this a little autobiographical moment, but when we all had to go to lockdown, and here at Columbia, it was really radical. Like, our students just left campus. And we were learning Zoom, and someone told me that maybe I shouldn't keep all my Zoom recordings because, who knows what was supposed to happen to them. But I did keep a recording. I was teaching a course, believe it or not, called Ultimate Knowledge and How to Get It, and this is like major people in the history of 17th century philosophy. But the reason to bring this up is that I was, so I had Zoom recordings. I was kind of curious to know what I said about a couple of things. And honestly, it looked like I hadn't showered in about 2 years, and myself to my students this way, but also students had just gone all over the country. You know, one person was all around the world. And it was so, I could get really teary-eyed again. I mean, it was so moving to see how horrifying, how distressed they looked. And the first 20 minutes of a 2-hour seminar was spent, so how's it going? You know, and we talked. But meanwhile, there were ambulances. I live on, by the Columbia building over by Central Park, and there was just every 3 minutes an ambulance. And so when I first saw this, after about 6 months later, I was just amazed at the vividness of the world, of myself, and the way it looked, my students, and then the reality. And there's something I want to make this almost a ritual in my life. I want to look at this every few months and remind myself of the horror. So it's a little bit it's not quite sacrificing a bird, but it's still somehow reminding myself of, as it were, the blood that we all had on us, and the need to remember that. So I would like to hear a little bit more about what you think about. I mean, your book is a way of making sense of that moment, but also a way that other people have remembered it, and we need to remember how they remember it. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about memory.
Well, thank you. So first of all, I had a similar experience. I remember it was April 10th, and I lived downtown near a hospital. And I remember I avoided looking at other people, and because I realized that if we made eye contact, then everybody would, just collapse, and that was not useful. So I was just looking at something on my phone. I looked at something on my phone for 4 hours. I mean, doom scrolling was our form of exercise, I guess. But yeah, I mean, this book is also very much, when I said I had to translate this for a French audience, it's also a way to remember those who, those times where, again, the angel of death was walking in the middle of the street, but also what we lived through. And again, the most tragic part of COVID, one of them, besides the loss of life, is that we didn't make much of it. I mean, I was hoping that maybe there would be some sort of self-transcendence, and that we built a better world, and instead of which we got people attacking others, people attacking flight attendants. So I understand that it is almost physiological that if you, I'm not retelling a story, if you put rats together in a cage, they'll have some sort of endorphins if they're together long enough. If you separate them, when you put them back in the same cage, they'll attack each other. So we're just rats, basically. That's the lesson. But yeah, that hasn't happened. So that's probably, yeah, that's a very painful realization that ordeals or challenges don't make you a better person. But I mean, that much we knew. But when it happens to you, when you have hopes that society will examine itself, and that the apocalypse actually is supposed to, after the destruction, create a new and a better world. What we have at this point is the better world is yet to come. So I guess that's maybe a messianic sort of conclusion. But yeah, I also wanted to mention the fact that the book is dedicated to the memory of Henri Weber, who was a member of Parliament, of the European Parliament, but was also someone who was born in the former Soviet Union to a Jewish family, emigrated to Paris, became one of the May 68 leaders, but had really this vision of how to transform the world. And he was taken by COVID in April of 2020. So there is, I mean, it's in his memory and a tribute to who he was, but also that's a way to acknowledge that there is still a lot of fighting to be done. And I guess, again, this is a sort of, I mean, a survey of religious texts, but also written in a very specific moment in time. So I guess that's, you know, that's part of me trying to make sense of it, and also trying to not forget to remember.
I think that's a wonderful